The next few days saw Drake recuperating after the arduous trek, and Kaysen reacquainting himself with a handful of old guard who he had served with under Hildebrand. With Helena guiding Kaysen around Malor, introducing him to the many changes the sanctuary had undergone since he had last visited, Drake was left largely to his own devices, which suited him nicely. He was at home on his own, and enjoyed the anonymity being a dirty urchin broad. On the occasion he and his uncle would find themselves together, the older man would caution Drake to keep to himself and stay out of trouble. He did not know these people, or understand their customs. However, Drake's cavalier attitude could not be quelled for long. It went against his nature to allow opportunities call to go unanswered. Before long, the boy's wicked eyes had gleaned innumerable occasions for mischief, though he was able to resist all save the most tantalizing marks. While never caught, had it not been for Ashe, there were a number of times when Drake would have been in a tight spot. Being left under her charge, Drake was repentant for the undue stress he caused the poor girl. This, more so than any chastening allotted by Kaysen, served to narrow the boy's greedy gaze. For a time, her beauty would enchant him, but so long as he was free to roam the streets, his hands would never be idle. In response, he found himself helping Ashe with the daily chores, which, in spite of his unruly disposition, pleased Drake, for he was thoroughly entranced by every word issued by the maiden, which Ashe took full advantage of. The days grew short and the nights long, leaving the pair stuck within the confines of the small cottage. On those quiet nights, Ashe's curiosity of the outside world would ignite a flame within her black eyes, and Drake would be bombarded with questions, most of which far surpassed his knowledge, though he would not let such trivial details hamper him. With each marvelous tale, Ashe's eyes would magnify, though Drake would always be left puzzled when they would abruptly turn cold and distant, leaving a trace of sadness which would linger for the rest of the night. She would often turn the conversation to more personal subjects, to which Drake would have normally responded with some romanticized version of the truth, but her dour countenance would always command a more grounded response. Drake found there was little he could conceal from her when under her charms. The tenor of their conversations changed once she discovered that he too was an orphan. Her reprimands of his behavior, on the few occasions when he slipped deeper into Malor, became less exasperated and more defensive of Drake on the rare instances his actions garnered unwanted attention. All was well with Drake. It seemed as though winter would come and go without incident, until one day when the golden sun made a rare visit to the sleepy land. Reinvigorated by such an auspicious sign, Drake was out, searching for some sport to preoccupy himself. The people of Malor did not busy themselves as they had in days before. Men walked about with antlers atop their heads and their faces painted curiously. In the courtyard where Drake and his uncle had been brought before Neville Levio, tables were being arranged, and homes were wrapped in fine linens. Kegs and casks were being hauled from the tavern into the open air, and on the steps of Neville's porch, women laid small treasures. Drake's attention was suddenly diverted by Ashe's petal-soft voice, calling out to him. "This is no place for children," she chastised as she seized him by the hand and led him away from the growing spectacle. Drake bristled at being called a child, but he found he did not have the heart to make the beautiful girl think less of him with an argument. Instead, he decided to indulge his curiosity and discover what was the cause for celebration. "This is the end of the year for the vermin," Ashe explained. "The snows storms will soon be upon us, and we will remain in Malor till spring's thaw. The bandits will bring tribute to their captain as gratitude for a bountiful year, and for safe respite. He will reward the men he esteems worthy of praise, and present the feast before his host to honor all those who brought glory to his name throughout the year." "Will we get to take part in the feast?" Drake inquired as they approached Malor's outer circuit. I do not think that Kaysen will be able to resist the temptation, Ashe retorted, but I wish you would stay in. There is almost certain to be violence. I have never seen a feast of Malor end in anything but tears. As if on cue, a rip of laughter rang out through the shabby hut. At that moment, Helena burst from the cottage carrying a tray of wooden mugs, giggling and chirping back at Kaysen, who followed closely behind her with a wide, oafish grin, toting a wall of plates that threatened to tumble from off their precarious stacks at a moment's notice. "You're such a handsome boy," Helena griped, as her keen eyes caught sight of the scruffy thief. Her stride never breaking, she squawked, "How have you managed to ruin your bath so quickly? Ashe, do something with that tangled mane the boy calls hair, and bring the ivory silver box once you're done." Ashe bowed and led Drake inside, where the girl released a deep sigh as she sat the scruffy imp down by the mirror and water bowl. The maiden then prepared a kettle filled with water and set it atop the lazy blaze residing within the hearth. After the water had heated, she poured it into a basin, dipped her apron into the bowl, and began to clean the dirty patches off Drake's face. Her eyes became clouded, and her normally gentle hand began to grind against the grimy patches on his cheeks. Silently he endured the scrubbing, till she returned to the present and dipped the apron again. "Tell me once more what it's like out there," Ashe asked suddenly. "I wish to hear of the wonders waiting." "Hydria is nice," Drake replied slowly. "It's a lot bigger than here. There are plenty of loose purses there, always money to be made there, always some lord or lady coming or going, even foreign ones." "Some like me?" Ashe asked absently, as she damped his unkempt hair. Drake shook his head. "I've never seen anyone like you." Quietly she teased his damp hair into peculiar fashions, before murmuring just above a whisper, "Sweet boy." Reaching for the soap brick, she ran her wet hands across its surface, coating them in a pleasant lather. "I hope to leave this place," her voice quiet, but bearing an air of finality. Drake wondered what had brought about such thoughts, especially on such a fair day. Unsure how to address the maiden, the young thief retorted awkwardly, "You don't much like it here," contorting his bowed head as much as he could, while she worked the suds into his thick black hair. She smiled, but her eyes bore no warmth. In that moment, Drake and his words were the furthest thing from her thoughts. He could not have agreed more with Ashe's sentiment. A beauty such as hers was not meant to be squandered, hidden away on this mountain, trapped among cutthroats and thieves. Though this understanding brought with it a pang of jealousy, as his lot was firmly rooted with such company. He was at home among the vermin. He had been raised in slums very similar to this camp. He had simply been a part of a wider world, and was wiser for it. There was danger, but for each loss another opportunity would present itself for the daring. Perhaps an opportunity was presenting itself even now. Ashe's words resounded in his mind, and he knew it was his heart's desire that she would be with him. When winter passed and those who hunted him had long forgotten his face, he and his uncle would leave Malor, and perhaps return to Hydria, or roam to some distant land. It would not be difficult to convince Kaysen to take Ashe with them. The only hurdle Drake foresaw was an all too familiar plight: coin. As Ashe leaned him over the basin and warm water rushed over his head, the wheels within Drake's mind began to turn. He needed to be daring. Here this night the wine would flow, and the wealth of a year's labor would be on full display. No one would be watching an urchin playing around the tables. Just like in Hydria, he would be a shadow in the crowd, and when the mind is muddled by mirth and wine, who can say what a night held? Anticipation coursed through his veins, and he knew neither his uncle nor Ashe would approve of his ploy, though his capricious mind counseled that their concerns would be easily soothed once he succeeded. Having finished the first of Helena's tasks, Ashe gathered their tribute for the captain of Mailer before leaving Drake alone to his thoughts. Kaysen and Helena came back a handful of times before they joined the festivities in earnest, but Ashe never returned. As dusk approached, Drake left the cottage and entered the crisp night air, and merged with the other party-goers. Their rags were replaced with richly embroidered cloth. Many carried banters and lanterns with colored flames. Music was already ringing loudly from the plaza, muddled by the cheers from the onlookers. Drake avoided several drunks who had gotten an early start on the evening. He saw some children dancing in the shadow of a burned-out hut on the edge of the party, and decided to survey his marks. In among the tables that lined the mountain dale, where the cookery's pleasant aroma beckoned to the young thief, the merrymakers ushered in tribute, placing the treasures of near and distant lands at the feet of Neville's home. The revelers were still too lucid for him to make a move, so he busied himself with children's games. As the treasures piled high in the orange torchlight, Drake would mark what could easily be carried off. Aside from coins that were haphazardly poured out on the tables, which Drake knew would be easy targets, there were a number of jeweled inlaid brooches, golden rings, and countless other trinkets of various values. However, once he found his mark, all others faded from his sight. His eyes came to rest on a small golden idol, which had been carelessly shoved amongst so many other treasures. The strange piece bore the head of a lion and the body of a woman, whose dazzling eyes were inlaid with two different stones, one ruby and one sapphire. The strangeness of the piece and the intensity of the jewels ensured that he had found his target. The stars began to shine as the sunlight faded into the west. Drake joined those at the table to enjoy meat and sup with them. Many delicious dainties had been prepared. Some of them he was completely unfamiliar with. He found he could not resist the sweet cakes of his home and indulged greedily in them. The food and the music threatened to carry him away, but the allure of the gilded statue's eyes was ever present in his mind. He could not be impatient. If there was no opportunity this night, then the young thief knew to be content with the food and entertainment. His uncle had taught Drake as much on innumerable occasions, though Drake's eyes told him it would be a shame to miss out on such an opportunity to reach such a precious piece. There were so many treasures that surely it would not be missed among such splendor, but there was much drinking to be done before any action could be taken. Kaysen had found some warm meat and a handful of poor souls willing to accept his challenge in a game of chance. His face was already flushed, and his bellowing laughter rang above the drum of merriment. Hopefully the bandits would follow his example. The night was clear, and winds rushing down from the mountains brought chills and more warm mead. Before the revelers became too intoxicated, the moon came into prominence. The pale light issued a certain serenity to the raucous spectacle underway. Neville Abio took note of the pleasant tranquility, and bellowed an order above the chatter that was lost on Drake. The command's mystery was soon solved as a number of young maidens scurried out from among the crowd and began to dance before the captain of Mailer and his lieutenants. The white light cascading down from the rocky enclave that surrounded the village created a dreamlike atmosphere. With the sweet sound of the ocarina and lyre, the dancers' movements were enchanting as they cast their spells under the crescent moon. However, the peace did not last long. Before the dancers had completed their second ballad, the crowd began to encroach upon the women. While a few continued to dance amongst the host, most dissipated, and others still were carried off by impetuous devotees. Drinks now flowed freely, and the roar from the revelers grew till the uproar pained the boys' ears as the sound reverberated off the mountain. Sure enough, as Ashe had prophesied, fights broke out periodically, which only added to the mirth of the onlookers, who continued to drink and cheer over the soft music. Kaysen's boisterous laughter rang out clearly over the others, calling for bets on the combatants. However, Neville Abio, from his perch, surrounded by the wealth of Mailer, dissuaded any serious rabble-raising on such an auspicious occasion. Eventually, Drake spotted Helena bringing mead to a group of lookouts at the edge of the village. Drake had assumed that Ashe would be with Helena, but she was nowhere to be seen. Indeed, he had been surprised that she had not been among those called to dance. His thoughts of the maiden were shaken by a sudden flash of light, illuminating the night sky. He was accustomed to such extravagance in the capital, but fireworks in such a desolate place surprised Drake. Among the cheers and jubilance, rocket after rocket was launched from the top of the captain's home. With the dazzling lights distracting the partygoers, Drake slipped from the table he was seated at and joined those who had gathered at the porch of Neville Abio. He weaseled his way to the front of the crowd and cheered with the lot of them. There at the front of the crowd Neville stood, in a gown that would have made the lords and ladies of Hydria envious. Over the rocket's roars and the crowd's frantic cheers, the captain bellowed some cry which none heard, but all cheered on, before he snatched up a fistful of coins, strode into the crowd to the last of the dancers, and pressed the gold into her hands. With the loudest and most spectacular firework yet, Drake made his play. Through the rail he carefully swiped the figurine and tucked it away under his mantle, before gliding back into the crowd, where he once again scurried with the urchins who ran about gleefully under the explosive lights. The crowd seemed to be none the wiser, and he believed himself to be safe for the time being. Though with such a valuable piece in his possession, he knew that he had to slip back home and hide it amongst he and his uncle's effects. The fireworks ceased, and more rounds were passed out. Drake began to distance himself from the crowd and prepared to slip back home, when he saw his uncle spring to life and barge out of the town square into an alleyway. A sudden bolt of dread struck the thief's heart. He hesitated for a second before he began to weave his way through the crowd to the alley where his uncle had disappeared. The alley was significantly darker than the courtyard, but despite his impaired vision, Drake had no issue locating his uncle. He heard Kaysen's voice, choked with rage as he engaged in a heated argument with at least two other figures. What perked his ears was the soft cry of a girl who Drake could not see. The shadowy trio had not noticed his presence, or at least paid him no heed. Their arguing grew increasingly aggressive, until a gaunt figure attempted to grasp Kaysen's stout neck. Heavy fists issued the vast man's retort, as he sent his lesser flying. The second was a much stouter fellow, and attacked Kaysen with a powerful overhead blow that stunned the corpulent rogue for a moment. Once the old scoundrel had his feet back under him, the savvy fighter tackled his foe into the stone wall behind the rogue. The first adversary shakily rose to his feet while Kaysen grappled with the larger shadow. A sudden cry from the hidden girl drew Drake's attention to a shimmering blade that sprung from the first bandit's fist, who was steadying himself against one of the stone hovels. Kaysen turned, but the foe he was engaged with hampered his movement, and the brigand prepared a lethal strike. In an instant, the sparkling eyes that had so enticed Drake moments earlier crashed into the bandit's temple, sending the scoundrel reeling. Now the cries were loud and frantic, and people from the celebration began to take notice. A pair of particularly burly bandits rushed the tangled pair and tore them apart. Soon a large crowd was mulling about the scene. Powerful hands seized Drake as Neville Abio parted the mob. Drake was dragged to the center of the mass, where his uncle was on his knees. A man who appeared to be the larger assailant was speaking to Neville and a small company in a hushed tone. Across from him he could see the crumpled body of the bandit he had struck with the statue. which had already been plucked from the ground. In the torchlight, Drake could make out the visage of Ashe, hunched with her face hidden in her knees, encircled by several ladies, including Helena, who were soothing the poor girl. Neville was now clutching the figurine stained with blood, reflecting on the words of his companions. With a motion from their captain, several bandits hoisted Kaysen to his feet and forced he and Drake after to the plaza. There, a grave Neville Abio stood over the pair with a baleful glint in his eye. He leered over them, clutching the golden figurine on the railing of his porch. His voice resounded throughout the square, once gallant, now terrifying. One of our brothers has fallen this night, this most joyous occasion sullied by two outsiders who we offered refuge to. Out of the goodness within our hearts, we took pity on these wretches. The vermin of Malor honored the covenant of the hearth, sheltered them from the storm, offered them a place at our table. How were we repaid? By betraying the covenant of the hearth, by stealing from the valiant, and slaying our brother. This deed will not go unpunished. They will be cast out to the pit with them. Kaysen spat and cursed out a retort, but his words were cut short by a spear shaft crashing into his ribs and the roar of the village. Ashe's cries of protest met a similar fate as she watched Drake and Kaysen be dragged through the streets of Malor, beaten and battered as they were led to their doom. Heavy hands and jeers assaulted the witless pair. With tears welling up in his eyes, Drake could see Helena consoling Ashe, even as the girl attempted to gain Neville's ear. Drake fought against his captor with all his strength, but he soon stopped his struggles as the crowd had easier access to inflict their retribution upon him, and he found he had not the strength to bear their assault. They were halted at a great gulf between the face of the mountain and the village. Drake could hear Neville Abio's proud voice ringing out over the audience, but the words were lost on him as he stared into the dark abyss that was to be his tomb. He met his uncle's gaze one last time. There was no longer any rage, only a look of pity before the apple-cheeked man was cast into the pit. Drake watched as his uncle's body disappeared into the shadow of the gulf. Terror filled his heart and mind, and he wrenched desperately against his captor's grip one last time as he was shoved forward and found there was nothing under his feet.